It was a warm Monday morning when Daniel Carter stepped out of his small apartment, wearing his freshly pressed police uniform. The shiny badge on his chest seemed to glimmer a little more than usual, as if it knew this day was important. Daniel had only been a police officer for 3 months, and today was going to be the biggest day of his young career. He had been called to testify in court for the first time. This wasn't just any court appearance. This was a major case that had already made headlines in the local news. Daniel walked to his car with a certain bounce in his step. He felt proud, confident, and maybe a little too sure of himself. Ever since graduating from the police academy, he had carried himself like he was destined to be one of the best. His instructors had often warned him about his arrogance, but Daniel saw it as confidence. Know the law. I've studied harder than anyone else, he would tell himself. As he drove toward the courthouse, he replayed in his mind how he would stand, how he would speak, and how the jury and the judge would be impressed by his knowledge and presence. In his imagination, he could already hear the compliments he would get afterward from his colleagues. For him, this wasn't just a court testimony, it was a stage, and he was ready to be the star. The courthouse was buzzing with activity when Daniel arrived. Lawyers in suits hurried through the hallways. Reporters whispered into their phones, and police officers stood in corners exchanging quick conversations. Daniel, standing tall, walked through the entrance like he belonged there more than anyone else. Some of the older officers nodded at him, but a few smirked quietly, sensing that he was about to learn something he wasn't expecting in the courtroom. The air felt different, serious, heavy. People spoke in hushed tones, and the sound of paper shuffling filled the background. Daniel spotted the prosecution team and gave them a confident nod. He had submitted his police report weeks earlier, and in his mind, it was flawless. Every detail, every observation, every action he had taken that night, it was all written with precision. Or so he believed. As he waited for his turn to testify, Daniel glanced toward the judge's bench. He had heard of Judge Vanessa Cole before everyone had. She was one of the most respected judges in the state, known for her sharp mind, calm voice, and zero tolerance for disrespect in her courtroom. She was also the first black woman to serve as a judge in that district, a fact that carried both admiration and, unfortunately, controversy in some circles. Daniel, however, didn't think much about her reputation. In his mind, a judge was just another person in the room who needed to hear what he had to say. When the bailiff finally called his name, Daniel walked to the witness stand with his head held high. He swore the oath with a firm voice, holding the Bible a little too tightly, as if to show he meant business. From the moment he sat down, he kept his shoulders straight, looking around the room like a man who had everything under control. The prosecutor began asking him questions about the incident he had responded to. Daniel answered quickly, confidently, and without hesitation. He made sure to include extra details, not just to inform the court, but to make himself sound thorough and capable. He noticed a few jurors watching him closely, and that only fueled his confidence further. But then the questions became more precise. The judge herself leaned forward slightly and began asking him about specific parts of his report. She wasn't rude, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but her eyes were sharp and her words were exact. Daniel answered at first with the same energy, but as her questions continued, he started to feel a tiny pinch of doubt in the back of his mind. Still, he pushed it aside. He thought, I'm the one who was at the scene. I know what I saw. What Daniel didn't realize was that this wasn't just another testimony. In Judge Cole's courtroom, accuracy wasn't enough. You had to show professionalism, respect, and humility. Daniel, too focused on proving himself, didn't notice the small shift in the room's energy. Lawyers leaned back in their chairs, sensing something brewing. The jury's expressions softened from curiosity to mild amusement. In that moment, Daniel believed he was in control of the situation. But what he didn't know was that the next few minutes would begin to chip away at his confidence piece by piece. This first big case he had been so excited about was about to become something very different, a lesson he would never forget. For now, though he sat tall, answered firmly, and believed that the court was seeing exactly what he wanted them to see, a young, smart, fearless officer ready to take on the world. Asterisk, asterisk. Judge Vanessa Cole sat in her high-backed chair, her black robe flowing like a silent shadow around her. Her eyes scanned the courtroom with calm precision, the way a seasoned pilot surveys the skies before takeoff. She had presided over hundreds of cases in her long career, some involving dangerous criminals, others tangled in messy disputes, but she had a gift for seeing through people. In just a few minutes, she could tell whether someone was telling the truth, bluffing, or hiding something behind a polished smile. Today was no different. As she listened to Officer Daniel Carter's confident answers, she could already sense the subtle arrogance in his tone. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from doing one's job well. It was the cocky overconfidence of someone who believed they were above correction. She'd seen it before in young attorneys, overzealous witnesses, and occasionally in rookie officers who mistook their badge for a crown. Still, she gave no outward sign of her thoughts. Her face remained steady, her voice, even her manner, professional. For Judge Cole, the courtroom was sacred ground. It was a place where the truth mattered more than ego, where respect was given to everyone, whether they wore a robe, a suit, or an orange jumpsuit. She had worked her entire life to reach this bench, and she guarded its integrity fiercely. Daniel, however, was too wrapped up in his performance to notice the quiet weight of her presence. He had heard of her reputation, but in his mind, he was here to impress, not to be tested. As the prosecutor continued questioning him, Daniel leaned forward slightly, speaking with the crispness of someone delivering a well-rehearsed speech. His words were fast, his gestures precise, and he carried himself as though the case's outcome depended solely on him. Judge Cole began to jot down notes. Her pen moved slowly, but with purpose. She wasn't writing every word he said, only the ones that mattered. She underlined certain phrases, circled others. To the untrained eye, it looked like a random series of scribbles. But to her, it was a map. A map that would lead her exactly where she needed to go when it was her turn to speak. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Even the reporters, who often whispered to each other during less exciting testimony, seemed glued to the exchange. They could sense a tension building, not the loud, explosive kind, but the slow, deliberate kind that creeps up on you like a distant storm. Daniel noticed the attention and mistook it as admiration. His chest swelled slightly. Every now and then, he threw in technical terms from police procedure manuals, almost daring the judge or the lawyers to challenge him. He wanted to be seen as sharp, well-trained, and unshakable. But in doing so, he began to tread dangerously close to condescension. Judge Cole caught it instantly. It wasn't in what he said, but in how he said it. A subtle emphasis here, a smirk. There, the way he leaned back in his chair as if he were schooling the court instead of informing it. She had dealt with far tougher personalities in her career. But something about this young officer's attitude told her this might be one of those moments where a firm lesson was needed, not for the case, but for the man himself. The defense attorney shifted in his seat, clearly waiting for his turn. He could sense the cracks beginning to form in Daniel's testimony. And if the defense could sense them, so could the judge. Finally, when the prosecutor stepped back, Judge Cole leaned forward slightly. She rested her chin on her hand, eyes locked on Daniel, and spoke in a voice that was calm but carried authority like a deep river current. "Officer Carter," she began, "you've given us a very detailed account of the events on the night in question. But I have a few questions of my own." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't casual either. It was measured, deliberate. And Daniel could feel the entire courtroom shift its attention to him once again knowingly. This time, it didn't feel quite the same. Double quotes, "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel replied quickly, straightening his back. He was ready. Or so he thought. She glanced down at her notes, then back at him. "In your report, you mentioned arriving on scene at 10:15 p.m., she said. "Can you walk me through, minute by minute, what happened from the moment you arrived until the arrest was made?" Daniel started speaking confidently, but as he went on, Judge Cole's follow-up questions became sharper, more specific. She asked about the sequence of events, the exact distances, the lighting conditions, the positioning of people. Within 5 minutes, Daniel's rehearsed confidence began to waver. The more she pressed for precise details, the more he realized his memory wasn't as flawless as he believed. And the judge wasn't raising her voice, wasn't showing frustration. She was simply peeling back the layers of his testimony with the skill of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. By the time she paused, Daniel felt a faint heat creeping up his neck. For the first time that morning, he wasn't sure who had the upper hand. And for the first time in his short career, he began to understand that this was not his stage. This was her courtroom. The silence in the courtroom was thick enough to feel. Officer Daniel Carter sat on the witness stand, his fingers gripping the edges of the wooden armrest. Judge Vanessa Cole's eyes were steady on him, her calm voice still echoing in his mind from the last round of questions. She had picked apart his testimony piece by piece, never raising her voice, never showing a hint of anger, but somehow making him feel like he was standing under a bright spotlight with nowhere to hide. Daniel cleared his throat. "She's just testing me," he told himself. "I can handle this." He straightened in his seat, forcing the heat in his face to cool. In his mind, the courtroom was still a stage, and he wasn't about to let the audience see him stumble. But then Judge Cole asked another question, this one about a detail in his police report that Daniel hadn't memorized perfectly. "Officer Carter," she said evenly, "in your written statement, you claim you saw the suspect approximately 20 feet away when you gave the command to stop. How did you measure that distance?" Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable. But in a courtroom, even the smallest pause can speak volumes. "I estimated," he said, forcing confidence back into his voice. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Estimated. Was that estimate based on any official measurement tool or training protocol?" He could feel the eyes of the jury, the attorneys, even the spectators burning into him. "No," he said, his tone sharp now, "but I've been trained to make accurate field assessments." That edge in his voice didn't go unnoticed. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Judge Cole, still calm, leaned forward slightly. "So you are confident your estimate was correct, even without verification?" Daniel's pride flared. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, a little too quickly. "I know what I saw. I don't need a tape measure to confirm it." The moment the words left his mouth, the temperature in the room seemed to change. A ripple of unease passed through the courtroom. The bailiff stiffened near the door. A veteran officer in the back shook his head ever so slightly. Judge Cole didn't respond right away. She let the silence linger, a tactic she had mastered over years on the bench. The pause made every second feel heavier, until the air itself seemed to press down on Daniel. Then she spoke, her tone still measured, but now with an unmistakable firmness. "Officer Carter, in this courtroom, accuracy is not optional, and neither is humility. This is not a place for assumptions presented as fact." Daniel's jaw tightened. Humility. The word hit him harder than he expected. He felt a flash of irritation. In his mind, he was just defending himself, proving he knew his job. But to anyone watching, it was clear he was edging into dangerous territory. And then it happened. The moment that would be talked about long after the case was over. Instead of acknowledging the judge's point or adjusting his tone, Daniel leaned forward and said, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I think I know how to do my job better than anyone else in this room." The room went utterly still. You could have heard the ticking of a distant clock. A reporter in the front row froze mid-scribble. The defense attorney's eyes widened in disbelief. Even the prosecutor looked stunned. Judge Cole's gaze didn't waver. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger. But her silence in that moment was louder than any outburst could have been. She simply studied Daniel, her expression unreadable, and then reached for her pen, jotting down something on her notepad. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Everyone in the courtroom knew that challenging a judge's authority, especially in open court, was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline fumes. Something was going to happen. But Judge Cole, ever the strategist, didn't react immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, folded her hands, and said, "Very well, Officer Carter, let's continue." Her tone was calm, but those who knew her understood this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel, mistaking her composure for retreat, allowed himself a tiny smirk. He believed he had held his ground. What he didn't realize was that the real lesson was just beginning. And it would hit harder than anything he had faced in his short career. Asterisk, the smirk on Daniel's face lasted only a moment. But in a courtroom, even a moment is long enough to be noticed by everyone. Judge Vanessa Cole didn't react outwardly. She didn't need to. She had a way of turning silence into a tool, letting arrogance collapse under its own weight. She glanced down at her notes again, her pen tapping lightly against the paper. "Officer Carter," she said in a steady, clear voice, "let's revisit your account from the beginning. I'd like you to describe the scene again. This time, focus on accuracy and clarity, no assumptions." Daniel straightened his back. "Of course, Your Honor." He began retelling the events from the night in question, speaking quickly, eager to show he hadn't been rattled. But as he spoke, Judge Cole's questions slipped in like small, precise cuts, never dramatic, but each one slicing away a layer of his story. "You say the suspect was wearing a dark jacket. What shade of dark? Black, navy, brown?" "Dark blue," Daniel replied. "Was it confirmed under proper lighting?" Daniel hesitated. "Well, it was nighttime, so you did not confirm the exact color." He clenched his jaw. "Not exactly. No." She moved on smoothly. "You also stated the suspect was running east. What compass reference did you use?" Daniel's eyes flickered. "I just knew." "Did you check street signs or use your patrol car's GPS to confirm direction?" "No, Your Honor." Her pen tapped again. The jury shifted in their seats, sensing the cracks widening. Every question she asked wasn't just about facts, it was about discipline, training, and the difference between confidence and overconfidence. Bit by bit, Daniel's rehearsed answers began to unravel. The one steady rhythm of his voice faltered. His sentences became shorter. A drop of sweat formed at his temple, and he found himself gripping the armrest tighter than before. Judge Cole's tone never changed, still calm, still respectful, but her precision was relentless. Each detail she pressed for revealed another gap in Daniel's certainty. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking on his. "Officer Carter, you've been on the force for how long?" 3 months, Your Honor." 3 months, she repeated softly, as though tasting the weight of the words. "In that time, have you had extensive experience testifying in court?" "No, Your Honor." "So this is your first time testifying in a case of this magnitude?" "Yes." Her voice remained even, but now it carried a subtle steeliness. Then may I suggest something? In this courtroom, your role is not to project how much you think you know, is to present only what you are certain of, supported by fact. Precision, not pride, is what serves justice here. A hush fell over the room. The statement wasn't loud, but it hit Daniel like a sudden gust of wind, knocking him off balance. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, she added, "And one more thing, officer. Authority in this room is not earned by speaking the loudest or asserting the most confidence. It is earned by respect for the law, for the process, and for those who serve it." The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. For the first time that morning, Daniel felt the eyes on him not as admiration, but as judgment. The jurors looked at him differently now, not as the young hero he imagined himself to be, but as someone still learning the very basics of his duty in the back row. A veteran officer who had been watching the entire exchange slowly nodded too. Himself, he knew exactly what was happening. Judge Cole wasn't humiliating the rookie she was teaching him. And in her way, she was doing it in front of everyone, so the lesson would last. Daniel, however, wasn't quite ready to accept it. Somewhere deep inside, his pride still whispered, "I can turn this around." But as the judge prepared to move into the next phase of questioning, he was about to learn that there was no turning it around when you were already in over your head. The real turning point was still coming, and it would leave the entire courtroom stunned. Asterisk. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. What began as a young officer's confident testimony had turned into a quiet but relentless dismantling of his certainty. Officer Daniel Carter could feel it in his chest, known uneasy thump of his heart, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that his stage was slipping away. Judge Vanessa Cole, however, remained composed. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't angry. She was moving like a chess master, each question a carefully placed piece. Leading to an inevitable checkmate, she rested her folded hands on the bench. "Officer Carter, earlier you told the court you were absolutely certain about your distance estimate. You stood by it firmly, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel replied quickly, forcing his voice to sound steady. She nodded slightly. "Then help me understand something." She reached for a folder beside her. "I have here the official surveillance footage from a nearby store, time-stamped at the exact moment you claim to have given the command to stop. This footage shows the suspect's position and the patrol car's position." Daniel's pulse quickened. He had forgotten about that camera. Judge Cole looked up from the file, her eyes fixed on him. "Would you like me to play this in the courtroom so we can all measure the distance together?" There was a flicker of hesitation in Daniel's eyes. He swallowed hard. "That won't be necessary. I'm sure the footage matches my report." The room shifted. A soft murmur ran through the audience. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, watching closely. Judge Cole raised an eyebrow, not breaking her gaze. "You're sure? Even though this would confirm your testimony beyond question." Daniel forced a tight smile. "I'm confident, Your Honor." Her tone stayed calm, but her next words carried weight. "Confidence is admirable, officer. But here, truth is not measured by confidence, it is measured by evidence. And I prefer evidence over ego." Without waiting for his consent, she signaled to the bailiff. Moments later, the courtroom screens lit up with grainy black and white footage. The angle was wide, showing both the suspect and Daniel's patrol car as the footage played. A courtroom clerk used an on-screen tool to measure the exact distance. A faint gasp escaped from someone in the audience. The measurement appeared. On the screen, 32 feet. Judge Cole looked back at Daniel. "Your report stated 20 feet. That is a 12-foot difference, Officer Carter." Daniel's mouth went dry. "It was a quick estimate," she cut in gently. "Yes, and you were certain it was correct. Certain enough to dismiss the need for measurement." certain enough to challenge this court's expectation for precision. The silence that followed was crushing. Every person in that room knew what had just happened, not an argument. Not a scolding, but a clean, irrefutable dismantling of his earlier arrogance. Daniel sat back, his once straight posture now slightly slumped. The smirk he wore earlier was long gone. Judge Cole didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with a quiet gravity that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Officer Carter, no one doubts your willingness to serve. But your badge is not a shield against scrutiny. In fact, it demands greater scrutiny because the public's trust in law enforcement is built on accuracy, honesty, and humility. Her words hit like a series of slow, deliberate hammer strikes, measured, precise, and impossible to ignore. She paused, letting the silence linger once more, before adding, "Let today be a reminder. Inexperience can be forgiven. Arrogance cannot." The gallery was utterly still. Even the sound of papers shuffling had stopped. Daniel could feel the heat rising in his face, not from anger this time, but from the weight of what had just been laid bare in front of everyone. In that moment, the case no longer felt like the most important thing in the room. The real drama was the lesson unfolding one that the young officer would carry for the rest of his career, and though the exchange seemed to have reached its peak, Judge Cole wasn't finished. There was still more she intended to say, and the next part would leave the entire courtroom stunned into silence. Asterisk, asterisk, the air in the courtroom felt heavier now. Officer Daniel Carter sat on the witness stand, no longer the confident young man who had walked in that morning. His hands, once resting casually on the armrests, were now clasped together in front of him, fingers interlocked as if holding on to something solid. The eyes of the entire room were on him, but this time they weren't watching a rising star. They were watching a lesson unfold. Judge Vanessa Cole didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, her gaze still fixed on the young officer. Then, in a voice calm enough to draw everyone in, she began. "Officer Carter," she said, "I've been on this bench for more years than you've been alive. I have seen officers stand in that very spot and deliver testimony with courage, precision, and humility. I've also seen officers lose their way because they believed their badge gave them power without accountability. The badge doesn't work that way." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his face flushed. He wanted to defend himself, to say this wasn't fair, but something in the tone of her voice told him this wasn't a moment for argument. Judge Cole leaned forward, her hands folded in front of her. "The authority you carry is not yours alone. It belongs to the law, to the people you serve, to the oath you swore. The moment you believe it is your power, something you can wield however you ab. Like you've already stepped away from what it means to serve." Her words were not loud, but they rolled through the room like distant thunder. Even the jury sat a little straighter, sensing that this was no longer about just one case. It was about something bigger. She glanced briefly at the audience before returning her focus to Daniel. "You challenged this court's expectation for accuracy. You challenged this court's authority, and in doing so, you revealed something important, not about the case, but about yourself. You are new to this job, officer. That is not a weakness, but arrogance. Arrogance will get you, and the people you are sworn to protect hurt." Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the words sink into him like stones into deep water. Judge Cole continued, her tone softening just slightly. "Do you know why this moment matters?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Your Honor." "Because," she said, "the sooner you learn this lesson, the more lives you will protect, including your own. Humility is not about lowering yourself. It is about lifting the truth above your pride, and the truth will always outlast confidence." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the gallery. A veteran officer in the back lowered his gaze, remembering his own early mistakes. A reporter scribbled faster, realizing they were witnessing more than a legal exchange. They were witnessing the shaping of a man's future. Daniel's eyes dropped to the table in front of him. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own words from earlier. "I think I know how to do my job better than anyone else in this room." Hearing them replay in his mind now, they didn't sound bold. They sounded foolish. Judge Cole let a few seconds pass, then delivered her final blow, not with anger, but with unshakable conviction. "Officer Carter, I will not hold your inexperience against you. But I will remember your attitude today, and so will you. The badge on your chest is not a crown, it's a promise. Keep it, and it will protect you. Break it, and it will break you." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The entire room was silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. Something had shifted deep inside him. The desire to prove himself had been replaced by something he hadn't felt all morning. Humility. Judge Cole leaned back in her chair, signaling the end of her remarks. But the echoes of what she had said would follow Daniel long after he walked out of that courtroom. The gavel had not struck, but the courtroom already felt as if something final had happened. Officer Daniel Carter sat frozen on the witness stand, his posture no longer rigid with pride, but heavy with the weight of realization. The echo of Judge Cole's words still lingered in his ears like a slow, steady drumbeat. "The badge on your chest is not a crown, it's a promise." He kept his eyes low, staring at his own hands. They didn't look the same to him anymore. Just an hour ago, those hands had felt powerful, capable of steering his career wherever he wanted. Now they felt smaller somehow, as if they belonged to someone who had been pretending to be bigger than he really was. The quiet in the courtroom was different now. Earlier, the silence had been tense, filled with anticipation and challenge. Now, it was the kind of silence that comes after a truth is spoken so clearly that no one dares to disturb it. Even the jurors, who had no direct stake in the exchange between Daniel and Judge Cole, sat still, their eyes carrying a mix of curiosity and respect for what they had just witnessed. Daniel wanted to look at Judge Cole, but he couldn't. Not. Yet the part of him that had been so sure, so certain, now felt exposed. And in that vulnerability, he began to feel something new. The uncomfortable but unmistakable stirrings of growth. He replayed the morning in his mind. The way he had walked into the courthouse, chest out, convinced this was his moment to shine. The way he had imagined the jurors hanging on his every word. The way he had told himself he was here to show everyone what kind of officer he was: confident, decisive, untouchable. But now, the image he saw of himself wasn't one of strength. It was of a young man blinded by his own need to be right. And what struck him hardest was that Judge Cole hadn't humiliated him, she had helped him. Not in the gentle, easy way a friend might, but in the sharp, necessary way a mentor would. He realized something else too: she could have punished him more harshly. She could have scolded him in front of everyone, cut him off, or even held him in contempt for his earlier remark. But she hadn't. Instead, she had chosen to turn this into a lesson. She had shown him his flaws without destroying his dignity completely. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted when the prosecutor asked a final question, one meant to wrap up his testimony. He answered quietly, without the sharpness or swagger from earlier. His voice was steady, but now it carried something else: a respect for the process, for the truth, and for the fact that his words had consequences beyond his own pride. As he stepped down from the witness stand, Daniel avoided looking at the audience. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't want to guess what they were thinking. He walked past the prosecutor's table, past the defense attorney who gave him a faint, knowing smirk, and toward the back of the courtroom where the other officers sat. One of the older officers, a man with 20 years on the force, leaned toward him as he sat down and whispered, Tough day, kid. But trust me, you'll remember this one. We all have a day like this." Daniel gave a small nod. He didn't trust his voice to speak just yet, from the bench. Judge Cole moved on to the next phase of the trial as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Daniel knew better. For him, the trial had already changed everything. The case would end eventually, verdicts would be given, and files would be closed, but the lesson from this day would follow him into every traffic stop, every arrest, every moment he wore the badge. And deep down, though he would never admit it out loud, yet, he felt something he hadn't felt when he first stepped into that courtroom. Gratitude, *, 2 weeks had passed since that unforgettable day in Judge Vanessa Cole's courtroom. But for Officer Daniel Carter, the memory was still sharp, alive, and echoing in his mind. Every morning, when he pinned the badge to his uniform, he felt the weight of it in a new way. It wasn't just metal and polish anymore, it was a reminder of the promise Judge Cole spoken about. His fellow officers noticed the change before he did. The young man who used to stride into the station with a smirk and a loud opinion now walked in with a quieter confidence. He still carried himself with purpose. But it was different, not fueled by the need to prove himself, but by a growing understanding of the responsibility that came with the job. One late afternoon, Daniel found himself assigned to a call-in. A quiet neighborhood. 'Twasn't anything dramatic, a noise complaint. In the past, he might have handled it with an impatient edge, seeing it as beneath him. But this time, he approached the residents with patience, listening carefully, speaking calmly, and making sure both sides felt respected. When it was resolved without tension, he felt a small but meaningful sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about looking good, was about doing good. That night, sitting alone in his small apartment, Daniel thought again about Judge Cole. He could still see her steady eyes, hear her deliberate voice, and feel the sting of her words. But now, instead of embarrassment, those memories stirred something different to respect. Not just for her, but for the system he had chosen to be part of. The turning point came a few days later when he was called back to court, not for the same case, but as a witness in another. When he took the stand, he noticed Judge Cole wasn't presiding this time. Still, he carried her lesson with him. His testimony was careful, precise, and free from assumptions. He spoke only about what he knew, pausing to clarify details instead of bluffing through them. There was no smirk, no bravado, just a young officer doing his duty with care. When the proceedings ended, the prosecutor gave him a firm handshake and said, "Good job in there. You were solid, clear, and professional." It wasn't the kind of praise Daniel might have craved before. But now, it felt better than anything he'd imagined that first day in court. Later that week, while passing through the courthouse lobby, Daniel spotted Judge Cole from a distance. She was speaking with another attorney, her robe flowing as she prepared to enter a different courtroom. For a moment, Daniel considered walking away, not wanting to interrupt. But then he remembered something lessons mean more when you acknowledge them. He approached slowly. When she noticed him, her expression remained neutral, but her eyes seemed to search his face for a moment. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice steady but respectful, "I wanted to thank you for what you said to me that day." Judge Cole studied him for a long second, as if measuring whether he truly meant it. Then she gave a small nod. "I hope you carry it with you." "I do," Daniel replied. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't just saying it, he believed it. She turned to head into her courtroom, and Daniel stepped back, letting her pass. As she disappeared through the heavy wooden doors, he stood there for a moment, feeling the quiet hum of the courthouse around him. That day in her courtroom had stung. Yes, but it had also saved him from becoming the kind of officer who thought the badge made him untouchable. It had turned a moment of arrogance into the foundation for something better. And though his career was only beginning, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He would never forget the judge who had shown him that true. Power doesn't come from the badge, it comes from the integrity with which you wear it. Asterisk,